Welcome everyone to this discussion. My name is Meg Sattler and I am the Chief Executive of Ground Truth Solutions. As people are taking their virtual seats, I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank the Centre for Disaster Philanthropy for making this discussion and our work on this topic possible. I also wanted to quickly thank ARAD, Arab World for Research and Development, our partners in research, crime and advocacy in Gaza, and also the 1,200 or so people in Gaza who have spoken to us over the past year about some of the issues that we're going to discuss. I will shortly introduce a incredible lineup of people that we have joining this discussion today, but I first just wanted to acknowledge that this is not it's not an intellectual discussion that we're having. The context in which this discussion takes place continues to defy, I think, some of our worst fears when it comes to the capacity for human violence, breaches of both international normative frameworks and personal and cultural moral codes. We've seen some of the gravest breaches of international law with the worst consequences, constant attacks on children, attacks on healthcare, blatant disregard for rules of war regarding civilian life, and of course the blocking of humanitarian assistance. That last point is ever more timely today, obviously, with the news of the passing of the law that would potentially, or in essence, ban the operations of UNRWA. UNRWA, an organisation that is currently supporting literally millions of people. My compatriot, James Elder of UNICEF, said today that this has sort of gone beyond the use of diplomatic language to describe some of these atrocities. There were fresh attacks just today in the Bekaa Valley, in Tia, in the Jabalia refugee camp has been attacked again. So, you know, when we talk about these concepts of mutual aid and support, these things are happening under the most extreme of circumstances. Ground Truth Solutions and ORAD have been speaking to people in Gaza for almost a year through a couple of bouts of research to try and find out what the humanitarian situation looks like from their perspective. We conducted a second phase of work in the Middle Eastern summer in June and July via face-to-face surveys and in-depth interviews. And we found then that 95% of people in Gaza had been forcibly displaced since the beginning of the war in October, and 50% had been forced to move 4 or more times. That now being 3 months ago, that number would have risen again. And it was quite clear from our research that the more times that people were forced to flee, the more negative their coping strategies have become. So everyone not eating nearly enough, not able to wash, drinking dirty water, not drinking water, sending children to work. And every single person that we interviewed asked for more support with food or water. But what was very clear also from that research was that every single person that we spoke to had either provided or received some sort of support from other people in their community or their immediate vicinity. Most commonly what that looked like was helping with the sort of daily business of survival, sharing tasks, sharing food and water, taking care of each other's children, sharing information, trying to find somewhere to charge phones, etc. In some cases, it was more formal aid collectives, people banding together to distribute food aid to vulnerable communities, etc. And 1/3 said that they were coping very largely thanks to community groups, especially in Gaza City. 13% of people cited support from Palestinians living abroad. And even in a context where people's immediate safety was so much at risk, for a lot of people, the primary fear was actually not about immediate survival, but about being able to rebuild after all of this destruction. And so we wanted to kind of unpack these issues more, and we've been really fortunate to gather an absolutely amazing panel of people to help us do that. I have to briefly send apologies from Georgios Petropoulos, who was going to join us from the United Nations in Gaza, but has had to go out on a field mission. But we do have joining us today Dr. Tamiras Fakouri, who is the Associate Professor of International Politics and Conflict at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. She specialises in peace, governance and migration in conflict and emphasises specifically the political agency of marginalised states and societies in the global system. We also have Mr. Amjad Shawa, who is director of the Palestinian NGO network in Gaza, which we will probably refer to in this discussion as PNGO, if you hear that acronym, and also Deputy Commissioner General of the Independent Commission for Human Rights in Palestine. He has a background in business, American studies and teaching, and has been very active in both rights and civil society since the 90s. We have Dr. Zaina Moana, who is an executive board member of AMEL Association with over 20 years experience in humanitarian support, particularly for migrants, refugees and women, also a professor at the American University of Beirut and an advocate for youth leadership. We have Yasmina Gerda, who was working for about 4 months as the intercluster coordinator in Gaza during 2 deployments this year, and is now working independently. And last but not least, we have Mr. Samer Sayed, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation and the Gaza Emergency Response Team Leader at OURAD, with a lot of experience in monitoring research, data analysis and social protection. Before we launch into the discussion, just a heads up that the Q&A section in Teams is disabled, but if you have questions, feel free to note them in the chat. We will do our best to address them through the discussion, but if we run out of time, which is quite likely, we will collect all the questions and follow up with responses afterwards, so don't be shy about putting down thoughts or questions. With that, I'm going to dive in. And I want to start with you, Dr. Fakouri. Mutual aid is sort of a concept that's become quite fashionable, I would say, particularly where I am in Australia. It's sort of bandied about as something that's quite a novel concept. Obviously, it isn't, and mutual aid has a very deep history across the Middle East, rooted in some quite long-standing traditions. Would you be able to set the scene for us in terms of how you see this sort of historical context shaping the current community responses in the region, particularly in Lebanon and in Gaza?
Thank you so much, Meg, for your question. It's indeed crucial to contextualize the notion of mutual aid in the history of the region. So community-based responses are not new. They have been key to alleviating and mitigating the impact of disasters and wars. So let me briefly develop this point by talking specifically about mutual aid in the context of mass displacement. So historically, Middle Eastern states, as we all know, have played an oversized role in hosting refugees and IDPs. And displacement has been a defining feature of Middle Eastern states, considered to be at the same time the host to and the source of some of the largest displaced populations worldwide. What is particularly interesting is that many of these states have opened their borders historically in accordance with social norms and responsibilities or in the light of cross-border kinship loyalties. At the same time, different forms of forced mobility have intersected. So we refer here to a displacement continuum. Consider Syrians, Lebanese, and Palestinians who have been at the same time internally displaced within their communities and across borders. So the internal and cross-border aspects of displacement are frequently intersecting parts of the same narrative, and this is very challenging. So mutual aid has emerged as a result of these multifaceted patterns and forms of mobility and displacement in the region. Cities today are complex sites where the livelihoods and destinies of refugees and host populations interlace. So I'd like to talk about, some scholarly work that has attracted our attention to how refugee and citizen economies and livelihoods overlap in some districts, let's say in Beirut, making it really impossible to speak today of separated lives, separated destinies. Another example, in her inspiring project on refugees as hosts, Elena Fidian-Kasmieh reminds us that in the Middle East, those that have become refugees have been previously hosts, and vice versa. So consider Syrians in Lebanon who have hosted Lebanese previously or who have been hosted by Lebanese. Or consider Palestinian camps in Lebanon where refugees from Palestine are now hosting refugees from Syria and currently providing support to the newly displaced. So by crafting their own safety nets, communities play the role of donors and aid givers. During the 2020 Beirut port explosion, what is underexplored is how Syrian refugees have opened their homes to displaced Lebanese. So as we can see, host communities, refugees, and IDPs might have different legal and different social statuses, but they find themselves facing overlapping crises together. Beyond episodes of war and displacement, the history of the region is so rich in terms of communities building together on an everyday basis coalition initiatives spanning economic, feminist, migrant, and refugee struggles. And today we are witnessing, as we speak, a myriad of self-organized volunteer networks within and across communities in Lebanon and in Gaza. So I'd like to talk about various and intersecting forms of grassroots humanitarianism. In moments where the global international aid architecture and nation states have failed local communities, communities have risen to the challenge, crafting their own humanitarian governance as agents. I'd like to call them everyday humanitarians. In so doing, they have challenged top-down versions of humanitarianism in which communities are seen as passive recipients of aid. So I'd like to stop here. There are, of course, several limitations to such grassroots forms of humanitarians and humanitarianism, but I'm sure we'll get to speak about that later. Thank you, Meg.
Thank you so much. That was a very succinct way of discussing a very complex topic. So thank you very much. And I want to really touch on this idea of sort of overlapping crises and overlapping roles where you nicely sort of describe communities as donors and aid givers and not just sort of aid recipients. And I wonder if we can throw that now to Amjad. How does this kind of resonate with the work that you are seeing and are involved in at the moment in Gaza?
Thank you, Megan. Thanks to GTS and to Aurad to give this opportunity for me to talk. What Dr. Fakhouri mentioned is very important, really, and this get me the first hours that I was displaced was tens of thousands of people from Gaza. I parked my car in front of Deir al-Balah in the middle area of Gaza Strip, thinking that it will be 3-4 hours and we'll be back. I got nothing with me. And this 3 hours, 4 hours became more than 1 year now of displacement. I couldn't imagine. It's not coping at all. We didn't cope with such situation. It's kind of resilience. I don't know how to describe it, how people can manage to live and to stay in such conditions. To tell you that it's unprecedented situation. It didn't happen from 1948 till now. Also, when I'm talking with the grandmothers about the situation that we are in, they used to have kind of corridors to leave. On October, when we displaced and we moved from Gaza to the south, there was no safe corridors. The people were attacked by airstrikes while we were moving from the north to the south. We lost hundreds. While they are moving, there was no secure corridors for people. And all of that, maybe Yasmina do remember, that the Israeli occupation forces claim that we have kind of a humanitarian safe area, which is about 10 to 11% of Gaza Strip. You can imagine the Bosch, about 1.6 or 7 million of the Palestinians on 40 kilometers, which mean that we have 40,000 in each kilometer, which mean we have 4 people on over 1 square meter. And these tents where the people stand were attacked, and we lost hundreds of lives in this humanitarian safe area with no infrastructure. It's a coastal area with nothing. And part of the people went to the UN, to the UNRWA schools, which became kind of shelters, seeking safety and security. And most of these schools, these shelters were attacked. So many families were erased from the reports. It's about 1,150 and more. And this morning, 5-floor building where people left Jabalia to Beit Lahia seeking security and safety. They went to this building to stay. About 30 children, 35 women, and others. 93 people were killed in this airstrike this early morning. And their guilt that they insisted to stay in Beit Lahia in the north, not to follow the Israeli orders of forcible displacement. All of that, they are suffering from no food, no water, and nothing. So people are not seeking corridors to outside Gaza Strip. They insisted to stay. It's a message. But the big problem that we are facing was the failure of the international community. About us as civil society organizations, we were displaced as other people, as the people themselves. Most of my colleagues, they found that their placement through tents with the people themselves, to stay there and to work with the people directly, with no equipment, with nothing. I do remember the first days of this war, first weeks, I used to work through one of the coffee shops to meet and to do my work, since there was no space to work from. Some NGOs were hosted by other NGOs, as Dr. Fakhouri mentioned, this kind of mutual. So we were hosted by other colleagues who has some spaces to give us. And through the GHOC, the Joint Operation and Coordination space that created by UN, although we were the first responders and the frontliners for such catastrophe, we were the people, with the people. We didn't wait for the donors to relocate the funds. We just moved directly to help and to do whatever on our responsibility towards the people themselves. And as I said, there was no water, nothing, no food, and people were not ready for displacement, because not only me who were thinking it's a few hours and we'll be back. Most of the people were thinking the same. But we managed through this coordination with the colleagues in the UN and the INGOs to make something different. But to tell you, I just tracked how many trucks loads get in Gaza from the early beginning of this month. 730 trucks only in about 1 month. Just to remind, before this war, we used, and under the blockade, we used to receive 800 trucks a day. And now, in such disaster, catastrophe, it's about 700. And we have to be very smart. Whilst the ABC report is clear about the famine, about food insecurity, we have to be very smart to distribute these items to about 2.2 million, most of them children and women. Tell you about, maybe I will have the chance to tell you more about the details, because it's need time and time to tell about the details. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amjad. And you paint a very vivid and quite painful and stark picture of what it looks like at the moment to try and sort of support communities who are doing everything they can to support themselves without having anything more or less that you need. And I know that in Lebanon, it's, Lebanon is a place that has sort of constantly been in these cycles of, attack, displacement, various kind of political upheavals. And I wonder, Zaina, if you can talk us through, from sort of the early days of this current escalation from Israel, what does the situation look like on the ground there from the community perspective, and how does the sort of network of support look from where you're sitting?
Thank you so much, Meg. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for taking the time to attend and this wonderful platform to raise the voice of justice. Lebanon has always been known for resilience, a word that we could not translate into Arabic, but Lebanon on average has at least one emergency every 2 years. And really, the past 5 years, Lebanon has been facing protracted crises, where really Lebanon faced all the types of emergencies ever, starting from a revolution in 2019 to a monetary crisis, to a socio-economic crisis, then the health crisis with the COVID and the cholera, a constitutional crisis. We don't have a president since nearly 3 years, caretakers, cabinet that cannot take many decisions. We already have an existing refugee crisis with the Syrian conflict. Now IDPs and the war, and so and we supported the natural disaster that happened in Syria and Turkey. So really, these what we call civil society or humanitarian organizations have been facing a lot, and knowing that Lebanon has very limited resources, response now reaching this war, Lebanon is reaching it. The first liners already are very tired, but we are faced with a catastrophic situation. Unfortunately, we can say that we are seeing the same scenario that started in Gaza in many facets. Now, Lebanon has 4 million with nearly 2 million refugees. So Lebanon has the highest refugee per capita in the world that supported and provided solidarity for the Palestinian crisis, previously the Iraqi, previously the Syrian, and already Lebanon has a big migrant community and has proven to provide humanitarian solidarity at several levels. But 1 month down with this latest escalation, already there are more than 12,000 casualties, more than 2,500 deaths, and more than 1.4 million displaced, which is almost equal to 30% of the population. Now we're faced with more than 1,100 collective shelters, definitely in very difficult conditions. A huge number hosted with the host community. And as my comrade Amjad highlighted, every person displaced thinks that is getting displaced for a couple of days, and it turned out to be months and years. And this is the sad reality. The problem is that Lebanon, at the beginning, like what we saw also in Gaza, had blockage of humanitarian corridors. A little bit by little, it is progressing. More aid is getting in, but now the needs are not covered more than 20%. So we still have 80% that are vacant. And we are seeing systematic abuse to international law, systematic targeting to hospitals, to first responders, to primary healthcare centers, with this continuous displacement because the war is still ongoing. There is use for white phosphorus, which is prohibited internationally. There are incidents of the use of depleted uranium, which is also not allowed, and this causes cancers and long-term problems for the environment, for the health. Targeting the press while them sleeping in their houses. Targeting more than 275 medical personnel have been killed since the beginning of the crisis, and access is being a big issue. So not to name the traumas, not to name child protection issues, not to name infections, and also the incident of the pagers and the talkie-walkie where 3,000 persons were affected in 1 second. And this is going to leave a big challenge of loss of limbs and also loss of eyes, which is something also to be highlighted. So we're seeing an occupation in the 21st century. We're seeing lack of respect of international law. We're seeing systematic attack to civilians and infringement of the sovereignty of the states, and the world is silent. And this is a big issue. And also we are seeing that there is on purpose putting Gaza and Lebanon in the dark, as also Sudan and other crises. So unfortunately, we are in 2024, and what we called for after World War II from the right for self-determination, which is the UN Charter, down the line now, we're not seeing any of this, and people are not being left with, we're going back to discuss the right of life, which is a major issue that we're all faced with, and definitely this is something to be taken up and to be raised up. So again, I can say the situation is catastrophic at all levels, humanitarian and definitely huge destruction that are happening on a daily basis, plus attempt to ensure occupation for the Lebanese lands, as also what's happening in Gaza. I don't want to take much of my comrades, but happy to follow up as needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zaina, and thank you for sharing in such detail things that are obviously quite painful to talk about. I mean, looking across both Gaza and Lebanon, in both of the interventions then from Amjad and from Zaina, we're talking about a situation where, you know, failure of the international community has come up a lot and is kind of a fact at this point. The blocking of humanitarian assistance, breaches to international law, all of that obviously comes together to also impact what sort of response can be implemented from a humanitarian standpoint. There was a discussion earlier on about, you know, this idea of resilience and what it means to be a local responder. One sort of very human difference between local and international responders being that one group is displaced and a first responder and the other group isn't, which is already quite a big difference. But we also know from, you know, many years of sort of looking at what happens in humanitarian responses that there is often, in any sort of context, some difficulty in coordination between the international system and some of the more informal local systems. Obviously, Amjad, you're working on that quite specifically, working on the humanitarian response, dealing with all kinds of different responders, trying to, I guess, work towards some sort of effective solidarity model. How do you sort of see the challenges there? And do you think there's anything that could be done to overcome those challenges given the extremity of the situation?
Thank you, Meg, again. And it's a very important question. And get me, in August, we commemorate the World Humanitarian Day. And on that date, I did remember that we have colleagues who lost their lives during this war. And I asked my colleagues in the office of Bingo in order to ask the NGOs in the network about names and if they lost any of their colleagues. You can imagine how many we collect the names. 300 people from our colleagues of the national NGOs were killed. Other 230 from the UNRWA. about 8 internationals. So to work on such conditions that part of them in the office here lost her brother and sister and their families. 3-4 days and she came back to work. I said, how come? How you overcome this sadness and angriness to come back to work and to deliver some service, to respond to the people. So it's something that's very important for us to keep delivering from what we have. Sometimes we give some hope. Really, I'm visiting some sites and shelters. The only thing that to sit with the children and women, to listen to them. I was getting them some hope. Instead of that, I give hope and they give me more energy. When I could see the children inside these sites engaged in some schools that we have spaces, it's not schools, classrooms from the tents, and very, very committed to go on such risk, in such time that traumatized they are, to be engaged on these classes, which is inspiring me. And this is the resilience. And Dr. Zena, we call it sumud. This is the real sumud that we have. So back to the office to give the others that what I learned from these children who has no clothes, no shoes, no mattress to sleep in, over. And nowadays, no cover. When I'm saying it's a failure of the international community, this is a failure. They know, they listen, and sometimes they close the TV or screen not to watch and to listen to these pains that we have. When I'm saying this is unprecedented, I'm scared. I'm in sympathy with my friends and colleagues in Lebanon. But the scared point that this is moving from Gaza to the north of the West Bank, to Nablus, to Jenin, to the other places, now in Lebanon. It's the same scenarios that they are using, the same plans, the same attacks, same evacuation orders in Sur, in Saida, in different areas. What I'm listening in Lebanon, it happened here. Accountability. My colleagues in the human rights organizations, day by day, they are documenting these violations, sending these documents to every corner in the world, to the UN, to the ICC, to ECC, to everywhere, in order to get justice to these victims. Our brave women organizations, I feel very gratitude for these women, really. And the secret behind this resilience were the women. We have about 30,000 widows, new widows. They led their families in such critical conditions. Just to tell you that 70% of the people who were killed were children and women. So these women created from nothing big things to cook with the WFP, and maybe Yasmina remember our critique about the WFP canned foods, and from to collect wood. We didn't use, I personally, I did it. I have this experience to collect some wood from the streets with my son in order to have an oven because we have no cooking gas. So I have this experience. My wife was cooking in front of this mud often in order to make bread. This is now in the tents, beside the tents, with no medicine. But nowadays, I cannot say that we have these mechanisms that we used before now. We have no food items, no food coupons, no hygiene, no medicine. Only we have this famine, no medicine, you know, just to visit the hospital. Personally, and to go to the gate, just to the gate, and I could see in the parking, the beds and people who are, the patients who are lying in the parking, no space. When this morning I was visited by a father, his son is a cancer patient. No medication. He's in need for evacuation, to be evacuated to outside hospital. Colleagues, this situation that we are in as Palestinians, I'm scared that it's a model could move to other places. Last point to tell, this coordination with the different actors, the international and national organizations. In the early beginning of this war, I faced so many challenges that expatriates who are coming from outside. They have this experience in Afghanistan, in Central Africa, and they just, from the crossing to the station to work, to apply something different from the context with no understanding. For example, to work with the community leaders, which was disastrous, to replace the national NGOs with other structures. Sometimes this is affecting our work with respect to the community leaders. Since Israel, the first attacks, it was in the rule of law structure, the civil police, courts, judges, everything to create kind of mass and moral status. So one of the things to remember what had mentioned by Dr. Fakhouri, this internal cohesion that we have, society cohesion, which you protect at least till now. Yes, we have people who are starving, with no medicine, no water, no space, no safety. But still, we are keeping this. I don't know till what time that we can keep this. So, again and again, to stop this, it's a priority. These genocide crimes to be stopped. The issue for me, it's not only humanitarian. When I met a mother, lost her son, she's saying, I need justice. This is real security that I'm seeking. Justice, no have rest. So all the items of humanitarian aid is needed, mainly protection for children, which is forgotten by the international community. The international community who just raise concerns with no steps forward. The concerns about famine, because they don't want to see famine, but it's there. The second, which is actions to stop providing Israel with weapons. These weapons that Israel is using, it's from the US, from other European countries, kill these children. You have to understand as policymakers that these weapons are killing innocent children and women, elders, patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Amjad, and a message that is heard loud and clear. Definitely, I think it's a question that I think has raised a lot of other fundamental questions within what we might call the humanitarian community is, at what point is humanitarian aid essential and at what point or how do we sort of make sure that it's not used to sort of justify bigger issues that are causing the need for humanitarian aid, which is a huge issue, obviously, across the Middle East. And it's an uncomfortable question, I think, for us as humanitarians, where we're so quick to talk about root causes when we're talking about things like climate change. Whereas, you know, in this situation, there's a lot of awkward silence when it comes to what the root causes of this issue are. So you have been heard, and I'm sure that many in this audience will agree with your very passionate remarks there. Yasmina, I want to go to you. You've been waiting very patiently sitting there, but I know that a lot of these issues, particularly about the kind of international system and some of the, you know, maybe accidental missteps that are made, the challenges with coordinating with some of these really essential local efforts. When you were in Gaza, you were at the forefront very often of trying to open up aid passages to the people of Gaza, often in very dangerous circumstances and often, unfortunately, without success, which I think is a situation that we're seeing more and more and has been vividly described by a lot of the panelists. Given some of these challenges, how important are some of these community level aid efforts that you would have seen in Gaza? And then I guess a more difficult question, what do you think needs to happen to enable the international system to kind of better support such structures? So if you could sort of come in and wave your magic wand, what would you want to change?
Yes, thank you, Meg. So obviously, I think context is everything, or whatever is being said today about Gaza may not be applicable elsewhere. But when we're talking about Gaza, when we're talking about Lebanon, we're talking about contexts where obviously you have very highly functional individuals, very educated people, very just very skilled people, and just very strong community structures. And so immediately when you arrive on the ground, you can see that the entire response is being carried by the Palestinians, who are doing nothing short of, honestly, magic with nothing. They're rolling up their sleeves. They're taking on tasks that honestly would be unimaginable for unimaginable for a lot of people. I've seen them work around the clock. I've seen them be creative. I've seen them just work through their losses, through their pain, through their despair. And you know, I was really, really bewildered by the impact that they were having. They're of course very well connected. They have a much better understanding of the context. They're just able to do things that no one else can do. And so they don't need much hand holding. They really need tools, they need support, they need enabling, you know, equipment. But overall, they're just this incredibly resilient and powerful society. So if you come from the outside and you try to impose, of course, your idea, as Amjad was saying, your idea of how a humanitarian response should work from the top down, it's just not going to be, you know, effective. It's not going to be moral. It's not going to be respectful. But more importantly than anything, also, it's just going to be a huge waste of potential and of efficiency. So I think when I arrived, which was in March, it was very clear to me that international actors had very much understood this very early on and were trying to leverage the community structures. They were trying to, there were some mappings that had been done on, you know, who were the influencers, and, you know, obviously a lot of work was being done through national NGOs, through local NGOs. So a lot of that was happening. And I can also remember that some of the allocations of the humanitarian fund that is managed by OCHA that I got to support and inform from the ground were hell-bent on supporting national NGOs first, local NGOs first. We were trying to get fuel for the NGOs. We were trying to trying to make them as powerful as they could be given the very difficult circumstances. Because of course, as Amjad said, we're talking about people who themselves have been displaced several times, but the entire structure of the NGOs or of whichever civil society organization we're talking about, women-led, youth-led, had been displaced, had been shattered. You know, I went into some new offices that had been built so people had been displaced from Rafah, from Gaza City to Rafah, and they were working off some sort of like garage, and they had literally a chair, a table, and they had managed to secure a laptop. Internet was mission impossible, etc. So this is who we were trying to support. And I think very early on, international actors were working on that with a ton of impediments, of course, because of course fuel allocations and all kinds of other things like equipment for telecommunications and all of that was not authorized to enter freely, and was limited and was severely managed by the occupying forces. So this is something that we struggled with. Among the challenges that we faced in this approach, I would say, of course, there's the fact that we were working with community heroes, really, but they were affected by the war themselves in ways that are not imaginable, right? So they were displaced. They had lost their homes. They had lost loved ones. They were themselves injured in the process of moving or in the process of delivering aid. I spoke to so many of them who were delivering food, and then boom, a bomb fell, and then all of a sudden they have shrapnel on their back, and they have to be treated. So it's like, well, these are the people that you're trying to work with, trying to support, and that in itself is a very challenging context to work with, because the situation is extremely fragile, right? Then there's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that I faced in this mutual aid or local community-based aid approach, which is that since October 8th, the situation in Gaza shifted a trillion times. Like, it's not like you came in and you had a nice little situation overview that was just reliable, and you could just rely on this community being here and this family being here and this community dynamic working a certain way and all of that. Everything was constantly shifting, right? Whether we're talking about the de facto government, whether we're talking about the family feuds, the socioeconomic power dynamics, the movement of entire communities, constant, not like one time, but like constant. One day they're in Rafah, the next day they're in Deir el-Balah, the next day they move to Khan Yunis, and it's from east to west, and it's constantly changing. That was extremely challenging, because you think you know something and you don't. And we were very often, I think, operating on what could be called outdated assumptions. That caused a few issues. Like I could cite, a community leader that was adored one day, and then the next day was treated as a villain, of course, because some intentions of community influencers sometimes are not aligned with the humanitarian principles sometimes. And it's just that's a reality that we cannot deny. So you work through the community, but the community is a complex fabric. And I think if I had to answer your second question, Meg, on the magic wand, for me, like one thing I fantasized often about was having a reliable place to go to be in touch with the pulse of the community, precisely, to understand if there was a shooting in a community overnight because of some family feud, like what was I to understand from that so that the aid delivery could work. And I know, Amjad, you and I talked about this many times. National NGOs themselves, because you were displaced, because your constituencies were constantly shifting geographically, power dynamically, it was very hard also sometimes to build the trust, to have that understanding of what was going on and keep the pulse on that community. So having a mapping that is real time, updated constantly on what is going on, who is influencing, who is, what are the subtleties that you need to understand in order to not make too many mistakes? Mistakes will be made, I think, but like, how can you reduce them as much as possible by having a mapping and an understanding of community dynamics that is real time, that is updated, that is subtle enough, and that sort of captures all that complexity of the fabric of society, I think would be something that would allow us, international, national, local NGOs, to broaden our impact a lot more. Over.
Thank you so much for those very honest and raw reflections, which are very helpful, I think, for people who are less familiar with both the context and humanitarian coordination to see what some of these real challenges are. I'm realizing that we're racing towards time, which I knew would happen. But just building off that a little bit, I want to throw to Sama actually to talk a little bit to something that you just said, Yasmina, which is you think you know something and then you don't. And I think something that we haven't spoken about too much yet, which has been a huge issue in Gaza, is information. And it's a war, but it's also an information war. Information has been blocked from getting out. Information that is false has been spread quite rampantly, but also from a purely humanitarian perspective. I know that when OURAD and GTS first kind of wanted to launch our work, and we were told, that's impossible. You can't do that in Gaza. There's no way you can do primary data collection in Gaza. And Sama and colleagues said, well, it is, you just sort of need to know the right people and you need to know how to do that. But there have been huge issues with information, as alluded to by Yasmina. Sama, you've obviously been very heavily involved in the Gaza emergency response in various studies and ways of talking to people with very many people and actors on the ground. With this issue of sort of correcting narratives and better supporting the role of community aid, what do you see as being the role of information and analysis in better doing that? And what has been your experience in doing that to date?
Thank you, Meg. I think it's the first and foremost, I think it's important to kind of distinguish between kind of community and mutual aid and kind of more formal and structured aid. And I think that this study or kind of the GTS OURAD work has really tried to bridge both the evidence base and the information gap around a lot and kind of showcase the gap that kind of exists between that formal and the informal. And I think from what Yasmina is saying and kind of which is the right, I guess, which is quote unquote the right answer to this question, right? In terms of why is information important? Why is analysis important? It's important for context, it's important for effectiveness, it's important to kind of, inform the response, make sure it's data driven and kind of information driven, to create that enabling environment. I think Yasmina also mentioned kind of, that the enabling environment and the tools for the local NGOs and all of that. Of course, data and information is important for all of that. But it's data and information, and then the kind of is also important as a mechanism and in and of itself, right? It gives people kind of recognition, it gives voices on the ground recognition, and kind of and it allows them, it engages them in the response, and kind of it gives partners credibility. It gives, it's not enough to drop assistance and aid on people from the air, right? For using these planes and kind of just dropping it regardless of and without knowing what happens after. So information analysis is very important in all of that. Of course, information analysis is also very important in helping us kind of, focus on what we don't know as well, right? It really gave us an opportunity to kind of discover things that we haven't expected. The whole idea of, especially in the first study, how some of the informal mechanisms of mutual aid that were appearing in communities, and most importantly was moving with communities, right? Yasmina kind of also talked about, well, people are constantly moving, so how are we tracking and how are we doing all of that? Information and data collection and kind of mechanisms of mutual aid move with people as people move. So if we are in Deir al-Balah today and we all move to Khan Yunis tomorrow, then all of those resources are moving with us. I mean, it may take a day or two, or there might be a lag, but in general, people in this war, and it's certainly in the context of Lebanon right now, I mean, what's happening in Lebanon is very reminiscent of the first few months of the war in Gaza. And of course, what's happening in Jabalia right now is a microcosm of kind of what the very first few months of the war. And we continue to see mutual aid, community support for each other to be very prevalent. And we continue to see it in both kind of the small and where possible and where there is opportunity, kind of the big. So, you know, it's I mean, you know, and I just want to kind of maybe highlight one last point. I know that we're out of time, so I'll make it brief. Is it's information analysis, while important in and of itself, it also contributes to two main things. One is kind of leveling the levels of knowledge and leveling the kind of the playing field for the actors from their different places, right? Donors sitting in capitals across the world versus kind of regional offices and headquarters and country offices versus kind of that field level, right? So information analysis can kind of bridge that gap, even, you know, maybe slightly, but at least it can kind of bridge a little bit that gap. And then the last thing I wanted to say is kind of the importance of using the information analysis, right? It's not enough to have data. It's not enough to have good analysis and good understanding of the context. What's really much more important is to utilize that information to inform and to enhance kind of the response and the knowledge base. Over to you, Meg.
Thank you so much, Sama. I guess riffing off that, I want to quickly and maybe put her on the spot, but to throw over again to you, Dr. Fakouri. You know, we've heard so many different facets of all of the complexities that are intersecting and impacting people's lives and the ability to respond to challenges in both Lebanon and Palestine. Based on the exchange that we've had and sort of your knowledge more broadly, what sort of international or global reforms do you think we need to see to tackle some of these more systemic issues in such complex environments? Not just to end on an easy question for you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Meg, for this crucial question indeed. So indeed, we've seen a lot of attempts to revamp the international aid architecture in the last decade. We've seen important attempts at bridging humanitarian and development aid in the Middle East. And the case of mass displacement from Syria has been often evoked as a test case for international humanitarianism in the Middle East, and it has inspired various initiatives. Today, we see many organizations adopting the so-called triple nexus approach, which synchronizes humanitarian aid with development and peace and stabilization. However, there are so many setbacks and challenges that are playing out as we speak and that my colleagues referred to, and I'd like perhaps to briefly mention them. So first of all, as Zaina and Amjad said, we are facing overlapping crises that range from the pandemic, economic shocks, disasters, and the current wars, large-scale wars. So there is acute awareness that we are in need of new and creative forms of humanitarianism that are able to respond to compounding crises that various communities are going through, whether we are referring to host communities, IDPs, stateless individuals, or refugees. Very important. Second, as Amjad said, I guess, in the face of human tragedies, we need place-based and people-based solutions that recognize people's shifting needs as they move, and that can guarantee dignifying shelter and livelihoods to people. I guess the response to displacement in Lebanon and Gaza, for instance, needs to recognize that people's needs are shifting by the day, by the minute sometimes, and that people's needs are multiple. They are economic, social, but they also relate to emotional and human security, to human dignity. Third, I think that we all perhaps spoke about resilience and self-reliance. This has been like somewhat popular in the last decade, and a lot of humanitarian initiatives have glorified resilience. But what we need instead are resilient and rights-based institutions, stronger and more accountable responses of global solidarity and responsibility sharing. So resilience and humanitarianism recognizes local communities as first responders, agents, rather than helpless victims. This is great. But it's important to reevaluate now the extent to which resiliency, humanitarianism really builds the bridge to development and to human security when it's not coupled with responsive and robust institutions as well as global solidarity. I have a lot to say, but I think I'm going to stop here to allow perhaps others to say something along these lines. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, both for that incredible intervention and for, as you say, keeping it quite brief. I know that we're at time, but I just wanted to throw to Zaina and then Amjad in case they had any final thoughts before we wrap up.
Meg. Thanks everybody for being here. I just wanted to highlight that, as Dr. Tamira has highlighted, despite the compounded crisis, we always see opportunities in crisis, and really what's happening here is re-putting into question these double standards in the world and realigning that humanity is one and all human beings should be allowed to reach all their rights equally. And Palestine is not a question of Gaza only, it's a question of justice. And I think we all need to, what happened here reshaped all societies. Hopefully some positive outcomes will come up after seeing all these atrocities. In a time where we're speaking about nonviolent technique, we're only seeing violence, not only genocide, but also ethnic cleansing in the 2024. So ourselves, an NGO that is neutral, non-sectarian, they destroyed already 6 of our educational, health, and social centers fully. They're out of function. We are operating in a mobile modality. We are reaching a huge number of areas. The education sector is at jeopardy now. As we spoke about the non-lost generation, which was the motto of UNICEF for the Syrian crisis, we're speaking about lost generation in Lebanon. And we know that our future generation is put at risk of armed conflict, of early marriage, of protection issues that could really shake our societies forward. In a time where we speak about equal development, we're seeing being put back, Lebanon, Gaza, all the other countries at jeopardy at the right to shelter, basic assistance, hygiene, access to water, which is not acceptable in our times. Unfortunately, despite everything, we are seeing strong safety nets. We are seeing how much the local responders, the localization model that allowed for the NGOs being placed here, having long experience to really respond in a fast manner and address the most crucial needs. Huge support is needed, being for Lebanon or for Gaza. What is reaching us is very minimal. We really call for international solidarity for the cause, but also we're calling for justice and for the respect of international humanitarian law that is needed for everyone without any discrimination. Thank you.
Any briefing, quick messages if you'll give me the chance. Yes, we need justice. This is A. B, which is protection for the civilians and civil premises as hospitals. We have only one hospital is working in the north now with very limited capacity. If it will run out of services, this is a warning that more lives will be lost. Third, your solidarity is very important. Your voices, as the voices of the victims, are important. That's why the solutions, it's between the hands of these people. Sometimes, yes, the expatriates are, these experts are very important, but who can give the solutions? The people themselves who left this crisis, and they are very creative. Third, about the nexus, I do agree. Nowadays, we are in dialogue with UNDP and with the other agencies about farming, with, nothing inter Gaza, but we will resume farming, the agricultural sector. Although fishermen are denied access, it's risky. We lost about 100 lives of the fishermen, but they continue fishing in small boats. And almost every week we have 2-3 fishermen who are killed. And they fish. It's the resilience, it's smooth. So Nexus is there, it's on our minds. But really, I cannot believe, to think about tomorrow. I have to live for today in order to manage for tomorrow. This is something that from the early beginning of this war, to live day by day, second by second, minute by minute. I don't know how we have this 1 year with these nightmares. Third, partnership. We are not contractors for any. We are partners for the UN, for NGOs. And this is support supposed to be in this direction. How we can really have this to enhance partnership between the national and international organizations based on the people priorities and needs. And the big discussion, we are talking about needs or rights. It's supposed to be rights-based approach. And the needs supposed to come through these rights. Third, fourth, Yasmina said about fuel. I encouraged my colleagues on the NGOs to apply to get fuel. You remember how many times, Yasmina? Tens of times to apply again and again. Only 4 or 5 national NGOs who receive fuel. From the tens of applications, it's under the control and approval of the Israeli side. So, although that we have no fuel for our ambulance cars, but we're still working. We will do our best in order to serve our people and to defend their rights and to amplify their voices, which is the most important thing, how we can really create this resilience model that could be reflected. We have to stop the West war and to work hard in order to stop it. Otherwise, each minute, while I'm talking, I'm receiving messages about attack on tents in Khan Yunis in the humanitarian area. About 6 people were killed. 2 women, 1 child. So children are the main victims because they are paying from their future and from Gaza future. Gaza will be constructed if there is a will, real will, from the international community in order to have peace in this area. Back to the roots of the problem, not applying the human rights and justice in this part of the world. Thank you and best wishes.
Thank you, Amjad. We are going to have to wrap up, and I wish we didn't, but I know that everyone has more important places to be. The hour's gone faster than I expected, and I want to thank everyone for your very honest and emotional and tough interventions. We heard a lot about resilience, but also were reminded of the fact that resilience comes at great cost. It is also an absolute lifeline for people in crisis, particularly in situations where aid is being blocked so blatantly. We heard about the absolute need for protection, about the sometimes uncomfortable relationship between community realities and perhaps Puritan humanitarian norms. But we also heard loud and clear, the call for sort of addressing some of these bigger issues. Justice was repeated many, many times. Humanity, peace, the calls to stop the conflict, and just the ability to think about futures, which I know is very important to everyone that we spoke to in Gaza. I'm sure that everyone here would join me in sending a massive, massive thank you to Dr. Fakouri, to Amjad, to Samir, Yasmina, to Zaina. It's been really wonderful having you with us for the past hour. We know that there were questions that we didn't get a chance to address and comment, so we'll try and get back to those somehow. But thank you all so much. I hope you've got something out of this, because we certainly have. And please keep up your amazing work and advocacy.